Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Just bear with us as we let everybody in. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is our third session in the series. This is the program on education policy and governance here at Harvard University, and it is directed by Professor Paul Peterson and Really Shattuck Professor of Government. Paul, take it away.
Welcome to the third session of our conference, Safe Place to Learn. This session is going to focus on disciplinary practices and whether there are racial disparities and what the connection is between these practices and the safety issues that many schools are facing at the present time. So the series is held from noon to 1 each Friday, and thank you for joining us. And we hope you will continue to join us in the coming weeks. I'm Paul Peterson, the director of the program. I'm pleased to have so many talented people with us on this occasion to discuss a really important topic. In 2011, the federal government launched its Supportive School Discipline Initiative that eventually led the U.S. Department of Education to issue a letter with the Department of Justice in 2014. This was the Obama administration, and it was said in this letter that was sent out to all school districts that racial and ethnic disparities in school discipline were unlawful, even if a policy appeared to be neutral on its face. Some people thought that racial disparities in expulsions and suspensions did not by themselves indicate that there was a racial bias. And in fact, Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education for the Trump administration, rescinded most of these guidelines or key elements of these guidelines. And yet now with the Biden administration, there seems to be a return to restoration of the original practice of the Obama administration. So this has become a very contentious political issue at the national level. At the local level, districts are doing different things. Some are adopting strategies that avoid expulsions and suspensions. Others are unwilling to make changes in their policies. And debates are raging as to what is the most effective step going forward. So these are the issues that we're going to consider today, and we're very fortunate to have three expert panelists. Before turning to them, I want to recognize Antonio Wentland, Nick Tavares, and Michael Poor, who have helped with the administrative and technical burdens for the conference. And I also want to introduce Daniel Hamlin, who has helped design the conference with me. He is a professor of education at the University of Oklahoma and an expert on school safety. And he and I are going to share the duties of the moderator in the session today, and Daniel will introduce the members of the panel at this time.
All right, Paul, well, thank you very much. Let me quickly turn to our panelists so we can get going. Our first panelist is Constance Lindsay. She's an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on policies and practices that aim to close racial achievement gaps in education. And she also looks at teacher and educator diversity in her work. Our second panelist is Chris Curran. Chris is an associate professor of educational leadership and policy at the University of Florida's College of Education. And his research focuses on issues of equity in education with a particular focus on the ways that school discipline and safety contribute to racial disparities in educational outcomes. And then finally, we have Max Eden. Max is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he looks at education reform, particularly in K-12 education, but also in early childhood. And he's authored a number of studies on education and education policy, and is co-author of the bestseller Why Meadow Died: The People and Policies That Created the Parkland Shooter and Endanger America's Students. Max has also testified about school violence before Congress, and also about the school to prison pipeline before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. So we'll get started with Constance, and then we'll turn to Chris. And after they've presented their research papers, Max will provide some commentary on those papers. And then we've left aside about 15 to 20 minutes for audience Q&A. And as usual, we would ask that you post succinct questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. And again, make sure your questions are succinct. That will allow Paul and I to identify the questions and then pose them to the panelists. So thank you very much again to the panelists. And Constance, why don't I turn things over to you first?
Awesome. Thanks so much. Let me go ahead and share my slideshow. Okay, so you guys can see that? Yes. Okay, awesome. Okay, so today I'm going to present some of my research that looks at the exposure to having a same race teacher and exclusionary discipline outcomes for Black students in North Carolina. This is currently available in EPA, and there's a version of it that's also in EdNext, which I guess we could drop in the chat if people are interested. So just to give you a little bit of background, a lot of my work focuses on the need for diverse teachers. And there's evidence that having a same race teacher, in particular for students of color, has a positive effect on a host of outcomes. So the original work was done by Tom D out at Stanford. And then many of us have sort of updated, have thought of different outcomes and updated some of this earlier work using these large state longitudinal data sets that are now available for researchers to use. And so this is an area that's super policy active that people are interested in. And my colleagues and I actually last year published a book giving an overview of this literature. But today I'll talk to you about my work on student discipline, which is joint with Cassie Hart, who's at UC Davis. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about sort of the motivation behind this work, there still is a huge gap between teacher and student demographics, and even though the public school student body is largely students of color, the teaching workforce is, forgot to start my timer there, the teaching workforce is largely white and mostly women. And, the public administration folks will tell us that these bureaucratic representation gaps can be problematic for a number of reasons. You want to have institutional legitimacy. And like I said, there's a growing body of evidence that teachers of color can have a positive impact on students of color. In North Carolina, this is exactly the same pattern that you see sort of nationally, which is that the number of white teachers has remained largely flat over time, where the number of white students is declining. The number of Black students and Black teachers is mostly flat. And then you see these this rapid growth in North Carolina in particular, and in some other states, of Latinx students and not too many teachers. But I can talk a little bit about it, but basically I'm going to focus on sort of these Black and white matches for today. We also see there's also continued concern about disparate outcomes in terms of both achievement and achievement sort of related things. So things like graduation rates, and then also discipline, right? So as we talked a little bit about, or was mentioned in the introduction, there's been a persistent sort of interest both from policymakers and from researchers in these disproportionate discipline gaps, right? And so there's a number of reasons why you might want to sort of understand and explain these gaps, because that's going to impact how you address them as a policymaker or stakeholder in education. And so, yes, okay. And so exclusionary discipline in particular, so when students are removed from the classroom, is associated with a host of downstream problems for the student themselves who is removed. So educational outcomes, but then also this is the start of what folks call the school to prison pipeline, right? And there's other folks who have written about how if you're taking students out of the classroom and you already see an achievement gap for a particular group, excluding them from instruction is going to make that gap worse. And so you can sort of understand the mechanisms through which exclusionary discipline, so things like in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, is particularly harmful for students. And so here, though, it's hard to disentangle sort of the impacts of this. And so one thing that we try to do in this paper is understand the teacher's role in this, right? So if you know how this stuff works at the school level, the teacher identifies a behavior and then refers the student on to the principal, and then the principal has to make a decision about about whether to discipline the student and the type of discipline. So what we try to do is just tease out the role that teacher race has on these particular outcomes. But there's a few things. So first, we see this is just a slide of descriptive statistics showing you that white students are less likely to receive exclusionary discipline. Black and Hispanic students are more likely to receive, although the gap is largest for Black students. But then there's also other things going on, right? So for younger teachers, they're more likely to use exclusionary discipline. And so we want to sort of disentangle classroom and school characteristics from the actions of the teachers. And so that's what we're setting out to do in this particular paper. And so prior to this study, there was little work on discipline and student-teacher match at the individual level, okay? There were studies that would look at sort of the composition of the faculty as a whole, but not necessarily the one-to-one match. So there's a great, the precursor to this literature is mostly in public administration. And then prior to this, there was a study that also used North Carolina data, and he did not find race match effects, but he excluded some of the larger metropolitan areas. And so we're using a lot more data, a lot more years, and a little bit more rigorous methods to kind of explore this question. So the research questions are pretty straightforward, which is basically, are student discipline outcomes related to sort of this match between between your race and your teacher's race. And then we just basically look and see whether these hold for different types of students and in different types of schools. And we also look by the type of infraction. And so hopefully that'll add some nuance to the conversation that sometimes gets lost when we're talking about some of this stuff. So just to give you a preview of the findings, race match is consistently associated with lower rates of exclusionary discipline. It's driven mostly by the Black student teacher match. It's true across student types and school types, and it's true across socioeconomic status classifications. I'll also save one nugget of the types of infractions that it's driven by towards the end. So that'll be a surprise for you. So to talk about the data, basically we use student level data from North Carolina. It's provided by the Department of Public Instruction and housed over at Duke in the NC Education Research Data Center. The sample that we use includes school years 2008 to 2013. And then we use elementary, middle, and high school students. We just do white and Black matches because even though the student body is growing more diverse, there aren't enough Latinx teachers to have the power to do some of these matches in this particular context. And so basically this leads us to have about 2.2 million student school year observations across 6 years for the Black students. And so the main analyses focus on that particular subgroup. So the main outcome is any exclusionary discipline action. So these are things like out of school suspension, in school suspension, detention, or expulsion. So kind of your most harsh discipline outcomes. We also look at so there's sort of the any category, and then we look by particular outcomes. So the suspension types, and then we also just check for number of disciplinary incidents. So remember, I told you that teachers refer the incident to the principal, and so that the number of incidents might be one mechanism through which you might see this reduction. And so our main independent variable is just the proportion of students whose teachers are Black or other race in a given school year. So just to talk to you a little bit about the descriptive statistics. Sorry, this table is a little bit too tiny, but I'll just give you the highlights. So one, most of the infractions happen in middle school, which makes the most sense. There is some variation over the sort of the elementary, middle, and high grades about the number of Black teachers that you have, but it hovers around like 23, 24%. And there's also some variation in the amount of students who are on free and reduced price lunch, but in our sample, the bulk of the students are on free and reduced price lunch. So basically what we do here is what we're trying to do is we're trying to control for unobservable student characteristics, right? So we include student fixed effects to estimate this main set of results. And then we add teacher and school characteristics that you might also expect to be related to discipline outcomes. So things like teacher experience, class size, where the school's located. And then we also control for student achievement. So their exam scores from last year. And so basically to confirm, so that's sort of the initial results. And then we also use an instrumental variables analyses. And so these were sort of first made popular by the Bettinger and Long analyses on community colleges. And so basically, the way you can interpret these methods, or what we're trying to do here, is we're trying to get to a causal estimate of these relationships by basically saying, you know, in a particular year, if the sort of marginal kid gets a marginal Black kid gets an extra Black teacher, what happens to their discipline outcomes? And so it's plausibly exogenous deviations from a long-term trend in your race composition of the faculty at any given school grade level. And so basically the first stage is an equation to determine like the share of teachers who will be from each group. And then the outcome of interest in the second stage of equations is a function of those predicted values and the other controls. Okay, so here are the results, sort of the overall results for any exclusionary discipline outcome. So in-school suspension, out of suspension, all lumped into one. And so basically what we find is not large effects, but pretty consistent effects. And so this is you can interpret this as a percentage point decrease. So this is just an LPM model. And so basically, if you are matched to a same race teacher, you are less likely to receive these exclusionary discipline outcomes. And then, so the rest of the paper, I'm trying to keep track of the time. The rest of the paper is just basically looking at, so we do the IV, and then where we find the same thing. And so the way you would interpret this is you would take the mean, and then you would subtract off the sort of the coefficient for the fraction teachers Black. And so you see the same thing, not huge effects, but pretty consistent effects, whether you break it down by grade level. And then we also just look at a bunch of different, we do a bunch of robustness checks and try to make the results go away. And we can't make the results go away, right? So we look and see whether you have a self-contained teacher. So that's limited to the elementary grades because we're able to see that. We include if you were in detention from last year. We include if you also were in detention. We include discipline from last year. We control whether you are gifted or have been identified for special education services. We also add school fixed effects. There were some wonky policy challenges happening in 2008 and 2009, and we exclude those years. And then we also do the same thing for non-Black students, and stuff goes away there. But what you can tell basically from this chart is that sort of the results hold up sort of no matter what's happening in terms of our sort of robustness checks and trying to cut the data a bunch of different ways. So basically, we find that for Black students, exposure to a larger proportion of a larger proportion of same race teachers decreases this likelihood of receiving exclusionary discipline. And so they're consistent regardless of whether you're free and reduced price lunch. It's consistent across gender, although the results are bigger for Black male students and different school types. I thought I included it here, but I'll just mention that if you break it down by the actual infraction of the students, you can find this table in the paper. It's actually driven by what's called willful defiance, which is basically the opportunity to have a cultural mismatch between your teacher. So you don't see the effects on things like drugs, violence, et cetera, because those have pretty prescriptive, if you bring a knife to school, you have to get suspended. Where we see the impacts for teacher race are really on the ones where they're more subjective outcomes. Okay, so we're suggesting that there might be some sort of gatekeeper effect from teachers. And let's see. So a few limitations. So this is just administrative data where we're trying to look at this effect. There's definitely needs to be a lot more work done on the mechanisms. We can't distinguish whether Black teachers have better classroom control. Black students might respond differently to Black teachers, or if Black teachers might be Black teachers might be more tolerant of mild misbehavior. But in any case, the student who avoids the exclusionary discipline might benefit from avoiding that loss of learning time. And we can't say anything about spillover effects. So with that, I will end there. And then hopefully we can have a pretty robust discussion on the results. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Chris.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Paul, and everyone else for the invitation to be a part of this. I'm really excited to take part and be able to share some of this work. Just confirming everybody can see my screen okay? Fantastic.
Yes.
So as mentioned, I'm Chris Curran. I'm an associate professor and director of the Education Policy Research Center at the University of Florida. And so this talk today, I'm going to present some recent research I have, an educational researcher focused on the measurement of disparities in school discipline, but also talk a little bit about sort of the driving question that I think was framed for this session around the causes and potential discriminatory components of school discipline. So just as a little bit of background, right, we know the issue of school discipline has captured a lot of attention in the media, but also among policy conversations and academic audiences over the past decade or two. We've seen, as was mentioned in our introduction, kind of wavering back and forth in terms of policy responses to this at the federal level, and a lot of action at the local level trying to address these issues of school discipline. And I think by and large, without a doubt, one of the driving forces in the focus on school discipline and policy and practice has been the consistent evidence that experiences of school discipline, particularly exclusionary school discipline like suspensions, happen disproportionately for students of color, and in particular for Black students. So the figure on the left may be familiar to a lot of people. This comes from a recent publication from the US Department of Education, drawing on data from the Civil Rights Data Collection. And what you can see is that of US schools, this is 2017-18, nationally, about 15% of public school students are Black. However, those students experiencing in-school and out-of-school suspensions are represented at a higher rate, about 30% of in-school suspensions, almost 40% of out-of-school suspensions are of Black students. And so clearly this is a disproportionate rate of exclusionary discipline for these students. And so this kind of finding is not new. I think it's been consistently found in national federal data, but also across a number of different contexts and across time, right? And it's kind of led to this general sort of conclusion that Black students are about 2 to 3 times more likely than their white counterparts to experience a suspension or other forms of exclusionary discipline. And I think what we also know, though it's not the focus of my talk today, is that these experiences of exclusionary discipline are also disproportionately felt by other subgroups, and that there are many intersectional components between race, but also for boys and students from lower income backgrounds, and also students that are identified with disabilities. So I'm going to do sort of 2 parts in my talk today. The first, as I mentioned, is to talk a little bit about some of the background literature and kind of motivation for the work I did, which I think addresses this question that was framed for our session. What are the causes and are discriminatory practices behind these disparities? So before turning to my own research, I'm going to present a few slides that summarize this prior literature. And then I'll talk to a bit about my recent findings, which I think sort of suggests that there may be an additional component that we need to consider as we think about understanding the problem and also trying to navigate potential solutions to it. So when we think about what the causes are of disproportionate school discipline by race, right, there's been sort of this competing narrative, right? And I think one of the central questions to this has been the question of whether these differences are driven by differences in behavior across race. In other words, are Black students just committing more infractions in school and therefore receiving more exclusionary or other forms of discipline? And I think there's been some mixed evidence on this, right? This quote at the top comes from Russell Skiba, and a fairly seminal piece of work and summary of work that he's done, right? That contends and draws on a body of evidence that finds that race continues to be a predictor of disparities in discipline, even sort of above and beyond behaviors and controlling for infractions. However, there are other studies that find sort of the opposite. Some studies that find accounting for prior misbehavior can account for and reduce substantially the size of the discipline gap. And so actually our discussant, Max, has got a kind of nice commentary piece that summarizes some of that work, and I'm sure he'll be able to speak to that a bit more. Over the next few slides, though, I'm going to present some evidence that at the very least, I think will suggest that discrimination and bias, broadly defined, play at least some role in discipline disparities, and that debates about differences in behavior, while maybe useful for thinking about discrimination or bias within schools and particular responses to schools, may sort of miss some of the ways in which structural forms of discrimination and historical forms of discrimination contribute to the root causes of behavior. So first, just a few words about bias, right? I think theoretically, we know there's a large body of evidence, even outside of education, that discusses stereotype threat and implicit bias. And indeed, in studies of school discipline, we have evidence that those things come into play, at least to some degree. Right. So I think of work by Barrett and colleagues that finds when a Black and a white student engage in a fight with each other, the Black student experiences harsher, more punitive discipline than the white student, even though engaging in the same misbehavior, the same fight. Other studies have found that educators are prone to watch Black students more carefully, prone to interpret their behavior and respond to their behavior with more punitive responses. Now, this doesn't mean that the entirety of that 3-to-1 ratio of the discipline gap is accounted for by bias, but I think it suggests that bias is at least potentially at play within schools. The second piece is policy, right? So often we sort of want to take the conversation then beyond the individual school and the actions of individual teachers and principals within that school. And I think policy and thinking about the ways in which discipline policies play out across schools is very useful for that. And so there's evidence that this occurs in school discipline. Some work out of Arkansas has found that actually much of the discipline gap is attributable to differences in the schools attended by students. And work by others, Payne and Welch, and some work by myself has found that students, particularly Black students, tend to attend schools that are using more exclusionary, zero tolerance type policies and are less likely to use alternative policies. And so just as segregated schooling, right, historically might have represented discrimination across schools, I think differences in how schools approach discipline, even across de facto segregated schools, may still contribute to disparities in discipline in ways that may not be discrimination or bias on the part of individuals in the school, but still may reflect disparities in discrimination at a more macro or sort of structural level. I think this sort of relates to the last part, which I've labeled here opportunity gaps, right? And this really goes back to this question of misbehavior, right? And so to the extent that some evidence finds differential behavior by race of students, I think we have to ask why, right? Even if a teacher or principal is doling out consequences evenly in response to misbehavior, there may still be causes of that misbehavior, the root causes that have a history in discriminatory policies and practices. In other words, we don't think that Black students are inherently more likely to misbehave, right? To the extent that some evidence does document differences in behavior, these may be linked to histories of lost opportunities for Black individuals and discrimination against Black communities. So I think we can see some of that, and it's written about by colleagues, scholars like Latson Billings and others, right, that intersect education with housing, workforce, criminal justice, healthcare, other sectors of public policy, right? And I think clearly show that there are histories and legacies of discrimination in those contexts that we perhaps unsurprisingly would expect to potentially still have an effect on Black students and other minority students today in ways that may influence behavior. And so I take this to say that even if there are differences in this behavior, if you find that in a particular context, I think we have to dig deeper to understand what may have been the sort of root causes of those. And when we do that, we find that there's a link, right, to policy and discrimination at a more structural macro level historically. And of course, what this means in terms of practice can be different things, right? Whether we are, as a federal Department of Education, investigating a particular school or leveraging sanctions against the school may look different depending on whether the disparities in discipline there are a function of bias of those individual teachers, or if they are functions of across school policies and so forth. But nevertheless, I think just as with an achievement gap in test scores prompting us to think about how we can better serve those students, I think there are similar needs with discipline to think about how we undo some of the vestiges of discrimination and make sure we best serve students. So with that as some context and backdrop, let me talk a little bit about the recent work I have that I think adds sort of an additional element to this, right? So as we think about how we address discipline disparities and as we try to untangle the relative extent to which behavior, bias, policies within school, across school, different factors contribute to the Black-white discipline gap, I think one piece that's got considerably less attention is actually how we go about measuring that gap. So recent work by myself, as well as some others, point to the importance of measurement for the study of school discipline. And so I'll point to this paper that came out just a year or two ago, an educational researcher. It builds on and complements some work by Curran and some other colleagues out of the University of Oregon that I think explores similar issues and makes similar sorts of points. But the study kind of suggests that something we have perhaps not been given enough attention to in the study of school discipline is the measurement of these disparities. And so, of course, we're familiar, and I kind of started my presentation with a familiar statistic that Black students are about 2 to 3 times as likely to experience an out-of-school suspension or other exclusionary discipline policy than their white peers. And that measure really comes from a measurement known as a risk ratio, right? The formula of which is at the top here. And it's essentially calculated by taking the proportion or the percentage of Black students that experience suspension or other exclusionary discipline and dividing that by the proportion of some comparison group, often white students, that experience that suspension. So for example, we could take the rate of suspensions of Black students divided by the rate of suspensions of white students. And with national data, we would see that figure that's typically in that 2 to 3 range. However, the risk ratio, though as popular as it is and often cited as it is not the only way to measure a discipline disparity. And so while I won't go through sort of the multitude of different measures that are out there, I am going to focus on a second one here in this talk, and that's the risk difference. And so this is the formula on the bottom of the screen. And essentially what it's capturing, right, rather than the relative ratio of two groups exclusionary discipline rate, this is picking up the difference, right? So here we would take the rate of suspensions of Black students, and instead of dividing by the rate of suspension for white students, we would subtract. And so we can see this in practice sort of with an example, right? So here's school A and school B. We can imagine in school A that 10% of Black students experience an out-of-school suspension and 5% of white students do. Whereas in school B, 3% of Black students experience an out-of-school suspension and 1% of white students do. The risk ratio, right, would take that 10 to 5, 10 divided by 5, right, and give us a risk ratio of 2 for school A, 3 divided by 1, a risk ratio of 3 for school B. The risk difference in comparison would subtract these. So 10 minus 5 would give us a risk difference of 5 percentage points. And in school B, 3 minus 1, a risk difference of 2 percentage points. And what may pop out to you here, just in this kind of stylized example, is that depending on which of those measures you choose to emphasize, the risk ratio or the risk difference, you may come to different conclusions about whether school A or school B has the bigger problem with disparate rates or disproportionate rates of school discipline, right? So namely, with the risk ratio, school B looks like it has a higher rate, 3 to 2. However, with the risk difference, right, school A appears to have the more disproportionate discipline, right, with the comparison of 5 to 2. And in fact, this is, I demonstrate in the publication, actually plays out in empirical data in the real world. So in the study, we look at data from the state of Maryland, and this builds on some earlier work I did with Maida Finch out of Salisbury University. And here we look at the different school districts within Maryland, which are county-based systems there. And on the left, we show the Black-white out-of-school suspension gap as a relative risk ratio, so dividing the two rates of discipline. While on the right, we organize the school districts by the risk difference, right, subtracting these two. And what you can see is that the choice of metric of discipline gap alters practical conclusions about who has the smallest and largest gap. Right? In particular, it turns out that Montgomery County Public Schools either is the most disproportionate county in this given year by the risk ratio, or if measuring by the risk difference, Montgomery County Public Schools is actually the least disproportionate, right? So just this choice of metric, risk ratio or risk difference, in this case comes to a sort of massive difference in our interpretation about which county may be doing better or worse in terms of disciplining students and where we may want to think about intervening in some way or providing supports to that school district. It turns out we can see something similar when we look at state level data and longitudinally over time. So this graph shows at the state level, again in Maryland, the rates of both suspensions and Maryland also aggregates expulsions into it as well, from 2010 to about 2015. The top line, the darker line, is the Black student suspension rate, while the gray line on the bottom is the white student suspension rate. And so over this time, as kind of was happening nationally, right, there was an effort to reduce disparate rates of discipline. And so you can see that both of these lines are trending down. If we convert these, though, to risk ratios and risk differences over time, we see sort of a much different story. So it turns out that the risk ratio, the gray line here in the right graph, is actually increasing over time, right? Becoming more disproportionate. And I think this was a source of some concern in Maryland that it seemed like despite efforts to reduce exclusionary discipline, the risk ratio was increasing. However, if instead we measure this as a risk difference, we actually see something that's maybe more in line with the trends of each group, which is a decrease in the difference or the discipline gap between Black and white students over time. So again, here, the choice of metric, the choice of measure makes a difference in practical conclusions about whether the state of Maryland is, say, closing the discipline gap or increasing the discipline gap over time. So here's the kind of quick takeaways for me. I think the evidence is clear that bias and discrimination, broadly defined, whether that's at the individual level or more structural levels, play at least some part in the discipline gap. I think pinpointing the exact extent to which that happens and how it happens and in which particular context it happens is more challenging, right? And this kind of goes to some of the policy issues of knowing how we intervene, who we hold accountable, and what we do about the discipline gap. My recent work and work by others in the measurement space suggests that as we continue to probe this area and work on this on the policy practice front, we probably need more attention to measurement, because that choice of metric can actually have very big implications for our practical conclusions about what's happening with school discipline.
Thank you, Chris. We
I
want
will
to
conclude.
here for our discussion. So thank you very much for that presentation. Max?
Yep, absolutely. And great. Thank you all so much for hosting this important conversation. And I, want to start off by saying that both studies and scholars that you all just heard from, I thought are, thoughtful and admirable. And I will address each of them in turn in the course of addressing another kind of large and consequential disparity in school discipline, which is the disparity between what the rigorous empirical research actually says and what the conventional policy assumptions and federal actions on school discipline have been. The Assistant Secretary in the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, now and during the second term of the Obama administration, is a woman called Catherine Lamon. Between these jobs, she was appointed to chair the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and in her capacity as chairwoman, she oversaw a commission on school discipline disparities that came to the conclusion that there were no underlying behavioral differences whatsoever by race, ethnicity, or disability status. None. Now, if true, then the entire disciplinary disparity that Dr. Curran outlined, the kind of 2-to-1, 3-to-1 disparity, would be entirely attributable to adult response to student behavior. That would be massive, and that would be a crisis. Of course, as the Washington Post pointed out, the research that Lamon cited to support her point actually contradicted her claim, because her absolutist claim is not empirically correct, and it would be frankly somewhat astonishing if it were. After all, generally we take as uncontroversial that risk factors affect student outcomes, that poverty matters, concentrated poverty matters, adverse childhood experience matters, family structure matters. I mean, in terms of school discipline, students from single parent households, regardless of race, are about twice as likely to get suspended as students from 2-parent households. These kind of should all be entirely uncontroversial arguments because they're entirely empirically supportable. But when it comes to school discipline, for whatever reason, these arguments that are quite empirically correct become politically incorrect. To bring them up in the public policy debate is to invite an accusation such as, are you saying that Black kids are worse? Or as Congressman Bobby Scott once said to me in testimony, are you saying that Black kids deserve to be punished more? And it's not about deserve by group, it's about what's the behavior, what's driving the behavior, and how should students and schools, how should schools respond? Given the strong kind of headwinds that anybody trying to argue for a nuanced position will face, a lot of the field of academia, as I've seen, a lot of the field of journalism, has kind of allowed a maximalist claim for the role of bias to go broadly unchallenged. If we were having a more responsible public policy conversation, it would sound more like what you heard from Dr. Curran, right? That some proportion of this disparity might be attributable to student behavior, some proportion to adult response. Then there's a question of how do we assess what proportion is what? And then once we have a reasonable assessment, how should schools respond to it? As Dr. Curran mentioned, there have been a number of kind of increasingly sophisticated and rigorous studies that try a variety of ways to get to this. The patterns apparent in it are the better that a study gets at controlling for prior misbehavior, the smaller the gap that could plausibly be attributable to racial bias grows. And some studies it shrinks, and in one study it shrinks to 0. There have been several studies that try to get to the question of, do principals make biased decisions with students sent to their office? And by and large, the role of race in principal decision-making has shrunk to 0 in several studies. I thought Dr. Lindsay's study, when it came out, was an excellent addition to the literature. It kind of somewhat indirectly gets at the question of teacher referral bias. I think Dr. Lindsay's study is extremely responsibly conducted and presented, but there's a plausibility that it brings up that perhaps some of the kind of teacher race gap is due to, or the school discipline gap related to teacher-student racial match is due to differences in ways that adults respond to students. And I thought it was an excellently designed study, but it's important to point out, as Dr. Lindsay did, that the role that she finds that could be attributed to bias within her findings, it's statistically significant, but it is less than 100%. Again, how we diagnose these questions matter, and how these questions have been diagnosed also matters. Unfortunately, when Catherine Lamon was the Assistant Secretary in the Office of Civil Rights, she appeared to be operating under her stated assumption that 100% of the discipline disparity was due to differential adult treatment. And she leveraged the apparatus of civil rights investigations to coerce school districts to change their policies to adopt more lenient policies. When a school district was accused of any incident of racial bias and treatment, it triggered a systemic investigation into the school district. And that systemic investigation, as it was later revealed, could only end when the school district agreed to adopt more lenient discipline policies. How this actually worked in practice is a very kind of interesting and troubling question. You know, Dr. Hamlin is a professor at the University of Oklahoma. The case of the investigation into Oklahoma public schools was pretty, I think, illustrative. The initial allegation faced was a Black student said that, hey, this white student and I both did the same thing. We were punished differently. And if true, that would be racial discrimination in the proper province of OCR to remedy. OCR, however, found that they were both punished equally for the same offense and that the white student was Hispanic. But the fact that the district had a risk ratio, as Dr. Curran pointed out, of over 2, meant that there was a systemic investigation conducted. This systemic investigation was conducted without any regard whatsoever to the actual policy questions and the actual conditions on the ground. The investigation could only end when the school agreed to adopt these discipline policies that were more lenient, regardless of their effect. And as the investigation was taking place, as the policies were shifting, the district saw a 42% decrease in suspensions. Of course, not much of a decrease in the risk ratio, but a poll found that about 60% of teachers thought that misbehavior had increased because of it. The teachers were allowed to speak anonymously, said things like, we were told that referrals would not require suspension unless there were blood. Another said, students have no consequences for their action. They continued to defy authority and disregard the consequences. Another teacher said, this is the worst student behavior I have seen in over 30 years. The violence in the hallways is extreme. Another teacher said, teachers are being abused physically. There is total defiance from students as early as in the 1st grade. Those quotes go on and on and on. None of this, of course, mattered to the Obama administration's Office of Civil Rights, to Catherine Lamon. This policy was finalized and formalized within the Oklahoma public school system. Despite all of these reactions coming out in the process of it, Oklahoma was not unrepresentative. There were about 300, 350 other school districts that faced investigations serving about 10 million students that were coerced into policy change on the assumption that a large share, if not all of the racial disparity in school discipline was caused by teacher racial bias or institutional bias. This is something that, as discussed, the Trump administration took another look at. They drew a kind of different set of conclusions in terms of the scope of the problem that could be attributable to bias. They rescinded the Dear Colleague letter that was driving these coercive investigations, but the Biden Department of Education seems all but set to reinstitute them, to reinstitute investigations that, if they do what they did before, will pressure school districts to adopt new discipline policies with no regard whatsoever to student safety, with a pure regard to effects on spreadsheets. And as Dr. Curran pointed out, probably if they do what they did last time, looking at spreadsheet indicators that are not actually well designed to the focus that they have, which is trying to reduce racial disparities. If you can't measure that effectively, you are not likely to have a well-tailored policy response to it. But of course, there's the broader question of whether policies and pressures to reduce racial disparity are the appropriate locus for thinking about school discipline in the first place. A more appropriate locus, I would argue, is to try to encourage fair treatment towards students, yes, but also try to encourage safe and orderly learning environments for all students. To the extent that these policies have been disproportionately pushed on schools that are more prone to falling into kind of disorder and chaos, they've had a probably disproportionately negative effect on students of color, and all students deserve to be served by schools who put their safety first, put order and learning first, and do not have their policies driven by spreadsheet data that they dimly understand with outcome metrics that might be ill-chosen.
Well, thank you, Max, for that commentary, and thank all the panelists for an excellent set of opening remarks and data presentations. I want to ask my first rather long question of Constance Lindsay, because I really enjoyed her paper, and it raises this question in my mind. I have been studying trends in student achievement over the past 50 years, and I have noticed that Black students have improved at about at a substantially more rapid rate than white students. So that Black students today are doing a lot better relative to white students than they were 50 years ago. About half of the Black-white racial achievement gap has been closed over that 50-year period. That's no small achievement. It's still a huge gap there. There's a lot more to be done, but we should sort of, think about what we have accomplished over the past years. Maybe the pandemic is going to make things worse. I worry about that a lot, but up to the point of the pandemic, things had improved quite a bit. It's unlikely that that could have happened if you had had a highly racist system where Black students were being penalized much more severely than white students for the same offense. I think your research, Constance, is interesting because it shows it's hard to believe, it's possible, but it's hard to believe that Black teachers would be treating Black students more severely than white students for the same offense. It's unlikely, and in your data shows it's actually there's a difference. And the difference is the same race teacher is a better thing to have for Black kids. So I think that's all very interesting, but it's very much on the margins. It's not a major thing. So the question is the political rhetoric in Washington today at a much different level than the reality of the problem on the ground in communities? And does this sort of lead us to the conclusion that maybe we would be better off with education policy being set at the local level than at the national level? So you may all have some comments to make on that, but let me start with Constance Lindsay's observations.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think a few things. So there's a few sort of points of nuance that I think get lost a little bit in the teacher diversity stuff, which is, so first of all, so we have a couple of studies looking at using the North Carolina data. And so our effects really are for the marginal Black kid who wouldn't have had a Black teacher, but somehow was exposed to one. The other key piece of this too, so in the discipline paper, the results are driven by this willful defiance piece, which is that sort of cultural mismatch question. In the other paper we have that looks at the long run impacts of same race teachers, the results really are the largest for persistently low income young Black boys. And then Cassie and I are also working on a paper that looks at gifted placement and special ed placement. And there again, the results are driven by persistently low income young Black boys. And so there's a little bit of nuance as to whom the benefits matter for having a same race teacher. But that sort of gets lost in the larger discussion of, of course we want to have a high quality, diverse teacher workforce, but there are particular groups and particular circumstances where these matches matter the most. And, to your point, I think that in terms of teacher policy, we know that teacher labor markets are highly localized. So yeah, it does make sense to sort of think about where and why does this matter and for whom does this matter the most? So, I grew up in Washington, D.C. We had plenty of Black teachers. It doesn't make much sense to focus on teacher diversity. And well, I mean, it matters in a place like D.C., but it mostly matters for kids who won't ever have the opportunity to have exposure to a same race teacher. And so it's those folks on the margin that we might be concerned about the most.
Any other observations?
Yeah, I'd like to kind of extend my comments and talk a little more about Dr. Lindsay's, which is, I've found her research, both in its methods and also in the way that she presents it, to be kind of very admirable, assiduous, and realistic. And I think that it's kind of impossible to go from that kind of research and those kind of findings to the policy that was pursued under the Obama administration and the policies that I think are likely to be pursued under the Biden administration, because those policies stem from an entirely different diagnosis of the scope of the disparity that is attributable to adult bias response. Is, in that view, such a large disparity that it is proper and appropriate to use the power of the federal government to massively limit the discretion that teachers face, and to kind of have school discipline policies North Star be an attempt to close disparities really without any regard to safety on the ground. It stands to reason if some share of the disparity is due to adult racial bias, then there's a role in which policy could kind of meet that and play a productive role. But if policy assumes that it's this much, when it's that much, then the space between is actually starting to cut into prudential judgments made by teachers that are in the best interest of all students. And I fear that that is what we have seen, and that is what we will see. Not policy making based on the kind of responsible, nuanced, thoughtful research that Dr. Lindsay has done, policy making based on a refusal to, countenance any disparity.
Chris, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I think I'd add sort of two pieces. I think one comment kind of to the comment of what's happened with achievement gaps, right? Black-white achievement gaps over the last half century. I think that's right. Like, we've seen improvements and decreases in discrimination and structural barriers in the education system that have contributed to improvements in outcomes, right? And reducing of that disparity, and not just in the educational sector, right? Some of that's pieces outside of education that contribute to and get reflected in test scores. I don't think that necessarily means that there's not discrimination and structural problems with regard to school discipline playing out alongside of it, right? I might articulate it as moving from a very racist sort of structure, right? If we're thinking about segregated schools in the South pre-Brown, to a less so, right? One, we've addressed many of these disparities, but that doesn't mean we've eliminated them all. And it doesn't mean that at kind of macro or more micro pieces of the system, maybe school discipline, that there aren't these pieces at play as well. I think directly to your question about, like, should some of these decisions be more localized decisions? I think yes and no, right? I think we've seen discipline become sort of politicized over the last number of years, and I think that becomes problematic because it drives people to different sides of the debate. And I think what's useful, and we even see it in this conversation right here, is that we can have people, probably myself included, Max and others, right, who have probably been out there in the public sphere with sort of different conclusions, or reading research and policy implications in different ways. And I think we can actually have a conversation and see a lot of overlap in our views, and have a nuanced conversation that says, it's not all bias. It's not all something else, right? It's a little bit of both going on. And I think maybe being able to drive it out of the federal discussion opens some opportunities for those more nuanced conversations to happen in localized levels where, what's happening in District A may look different than District B in ways that can kind of drive better outcomes. At the same time, though, I think, right, there is some federal role potentially, right, to ensure kind of accountability and make sure that there aren't things happening problematically in a district. And that's where some of these mechanisms are for investigation. And if used properly, right, they can potentially sort of act as a counter check to localized decision making.
We've got some great questions in the chat that I hope we can get to. So there's one here from Zahida Alaka from the University of Toronto. Do you have any suggestions for how we can select an appropriate metric? So Chris, you presented some, I think, fascinating data showing how one county could go from best to worst or worst to best, depending on the metric that you use. Do the panelists have any insight into what we should be using as a metric?
It's the punchline I wish I had, right? To say, here's the metric you should use. I'm afraid it's not that simple, right? I think, like, neither of these metrics, the risk ratio or the risk difference, or there's others out there that I didn't talk about, none of them are right or wrong, right? They're sort of different ways of describing a similar phenomenon or different parts of that phenomenon. And so I think the kind of takeaway for me is multiple metrics matter, right? Like looking at the change in the Black suspension rate, the white suspension rate, looking at the risk ratio, looking at the risk difference. All of these allow us to just have a conversation that's more informed, right? So we don't say, look, Maryland is making things worse. Well, maybe they are from one metric, maybe they're not from another, but by looking at both, we can begin to dig into why that might be and kind of what our priorities are.
The other important metric that frequently gets entirely lost in this conversation is a genuine metric of school safety and school climate, right? Because there has been this way when the conversation kind of can begin and end with discipline and discipline disparities, the goal becomes reducing suspensions, closing the gaps however they're measured, and that corrupts suspension as a measurement and a proxy for misbehavior. If there's an effort to reduce a response to misbehavior, then you could very well have a situation that, things look like they're getting better on paper. You can call victory in the public sphere, but things are actually getting worse on the ground for students. This is something that, I've been trying to look into for several years, ringing the alarm about. Frankly, the school survey data that's public, there was not much of it, and much of what there was trending in a bad direction in school districts where this is taking place. So I would say, any effort to address school district policy, discipline disparities, if it is not done with a keen eye towards what students and teachers actually feel about if their classes are getting safer, staying the same, getting less safe, is kind of a misguided approach.
The debate that's taking place is a debate that uses statistics all the time, and that's why Chris's contribution here is so interesting, because it sort of implies that the more that you do to reduce suspensions across the board, the higher the risk ratio is going to be. I mean, that's just clearly what your data was showing. In other words, we're going to be told, if in fact we reduce the number of suspensions, which is probably the case, that seems to be a policy that's being pursued out there by many school districts. So we're going to see a national decline in school suspensions, probably expulsions, unless there's some countervailing force out there moving in a different direction. We're going to see the apparent risks to minorities to be on the increase. So, it's like Mark Twain says, there's liars, damn liars, and statistics. So we got to be very careful about this. And that's why that contribution is such an interesting one, Chris. I don't know if you have any reaction to that. Can you get the right, I know you said you can't get the right statistic, but then should we abandon them altogether? How are you going to solve this?
Maybe we'll say nobody has the right statistic yet. I think there's promising work happening and different people thinking about these kind of measurement issues. I think the phenomenon you're describing, sort of decreasing discipline rates but increasing risk ratios, I think we've seen that empirically a lot of times. I don't know that has to be the case, right? We could decrease both black and white suspension rates, while also decreasing the risk ratio, depending on how each group is relatively decreasing. But yes, I think sort of the phenomenon tends to be that tends to happen. But, to me, again, I don't think there's a single metric, but it's the importance of looking at multiple metrics and saying, well, maybe the risk ratio didn't budge, maybe it went up a little bit, but if we're suspending half as many black students as we did before, and we think we're doing that without compromising safety, or, doing that in a way that's addressing bias rather than just sort of cooking the books by underreporting or not using suspensions appropriately, then maybe that's a good thing, right? Even if the risk ratio maybe doesn't reflect huge changes in the racial disproportionality of it.
But there may be another exaggeration that's going on in politics here, and that is, and Max, I want to ask this question of you. Do you really think that the investigations by the Obama administration, and it's true that some school districts were targeted and were asked to change their policies in fairly dramatic ways. Do you really think this had a pervasive effect on the American educational system, or has this federal policy, the significance of this federal policy, been exaggerated in the political debate?
No, I think it is, if anything, been dramatically kind of understated in the public debate, right? What you will kind of always read from mainstream news accounts is that the Dear Colleague letter was non-binding guidance, which it was not. It was the pretext for investigations, which, to the best of my estimate, affected about 350 school districts serving 10 million students, and was explicitly used to pressure them to adopt a slew of, particular policies favored by the Obama administration. Now, that was only part of its effect. There was a broader kind of conversational reorientation about school discipline that took place, wherein the central question became a question of how do we reduce racial disparities, and how do we measure them, how do we reduce them, versus how do we maintain safe and orderly schools. I think that the education group mind shifted its definition of the problem of school discipline because of this federal initiative, because of this data that's come out, because of, I think, an inability to properly grapple with this data. And this idea of restorative justice, which you haven't quite gotten to and don't have time to get into in depth, it kind of went from nowhere as early as 2009, 2010. It kind of started in Oakland around that time, to being in more than half of schools, according to a survey that came a couple of years ago. So I think there has been a substantial change across the board, a kind of a sea change in the way that schools think about and approach discipline that's been downstream of this federal policy shift.
All right, we've got about 1 minute left. Constance, if I could just ask you one quick final question. So I've got your study on my syllabus, and my students last semester had a very lengthy discussion about what your results mean. So could you kind of intimated that they were somewhat small. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about the practical significance of your findings?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important to sort of read it in context of the larger literature on teacher diversity. But also, yeah, so I think the practical thing for me is understanding like the context and the mechanisms through which some of these effects occur. So I'll put a plug out here, a shameless plug out here for a study that just came out in Science Advances, where we actually seek to intervene with teachers of all races to mitigate their biases they might have against students. And we find that, giving them sort of an implicit bias intervention does reduce suspensions over the year of the intervention and then for the year after. So, practically, I mean, I think we always sort of wind up to this, because the student body is diversifying, it's good to have this diverse teacher workforce. But there's also lots of stuff that we can do sort of in the meantime, thinking about how we train all teachers right now, thinking about the fact that if you have a highly suspending school, it's more than likely a distressed school community. So thinking about leadership, just thinking about sort of going a little bit more beyond just sort of that statistical reduction and thinking about thinking about extensions to the policies and practices that lead to a positive school climate. That's more so where I'm interested sort of in moving forward, but I'm happy you have that on the syllabus.
All right, well, thank you very much. So very quickly, thank you to all the panelists. Really appreciated these presentations today. Next week, we'll be meeting again to discuss trends in school shootings. We have a panel that is as good as this one was today. So I hope you'll join us next week. Thank you again to everyone.
Thank you very much for joining us.